Well, it wouldn't be back to school without my son bringing home some sort of illness, so we are all sick. Hooray! So, if my voice sounds a little scratchy, or if I sniffle a bit, it's because I'm sick. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Hey friends, welcome back to another Monday morning watercolor tips. It is in fact Monday morning as I am filming this, so if you think I look tired, it's because I am. I am tired. But to be true with the aesthetics of this video and it being authentic to being a Monday morning, I am putting in the bare minimum of getting ready for these videos because I feel like giving you watercolor tips is more important than looking more put together and less tired. So let's jump into it. In today's video, I am going to be talking about the right amount of water you need, specifically for wet on wet. I know water control is like a huge struggle for so many of us, especially when we're doing some wet on wet techniques, whether you're dropping in color or adding a darker shadow onto an already wet surface. It just sometimes creates blooms. It doesn't work out the way you want it. So how much water do you actually need? So that is what we are going over. Let's get into it. Grab your coffee, grab your tea, and let's go. Okay, so when we're talking about how much water we need on our paper, when we are doing something like wet on wet, it varies between project. So if I were to be doing a background sky on this paper, which I believe is like 8.5 by 11 or something, 7 by 10, okay? I would need one to use a bigger brush so I could get enough water to make sure that the whole thing is evenly wet. But I also want to make sure that I'm not using too much water, that if I were to tilt it, it'd be dripping off my page, okay? So the rule of thumb of what you need to be looking for when you are doing wet on wet or creating a wet background is you want to look for a sheen. And I'm going to try and show you, I'm just going to add a little bit of color to it so you guys can see it, because it is harder to see on camera. Okay, I'm going to just do a circle here. I'm going to show you what not to do, okay? I like to add a bunch of water just because also the more water we add, the less likely it is to dry really fast. But before we add in or drop in our color, there's a couple things you need to look for, okay? This is what we don't want to have, okay? If you were to tilt your paper to the side, like I said, you get this puddle. You do not want a puddle, okay? Because when you drop in that color, I'm going to show you what happens. It doesn't disperse like you want it to. It sits in that puddle, see? Sits in the puddle, doesn't do what it's supposed to. So instead, if you do have too much water, you're going to pick up your painting, tilt it to the side a bit, see if there's a puddle. You can either mop it up with your brush. So I'm just drying my brush off on my paper towel, and I'm just going to kind of pull up some of that color. If there's just too much, just take your paper towel. Just go like that a little bit. And then what you're going to do is you're going to just move that water around so you have a nice even coat, but it's not pooling. What you're looking for is something called a sheen. So again, we're going to pick up our paper and you're going to tilt it towards the light. See that shine, which is called a sheen? That is what you're looking for. You don't want a pool, so I'm not getting a pool when I'm tilting it, but you're getting a nice even shine across the whole thing. Also, this helps you when a certain part of it starts to dry. You'll see it's not going to shine like that, okay? You want to see this nice sheen over the whole area that you are making wet. So now when you drop in your color, you'll get little blooms, like the little color blooms. Now, another factor of this is how much water do you need on your brush? Because if you have too much water, I'm going to show you. I'm going to have like drips of water here. Again, it's going to create, I got a bigger bloom there, which is nice, but it's creating a pool. We don't want a pool. So like in my last video, was it my last video? I think I said, always, just without doubt, just tap your brush on your paper towel. It is going to take off some of that unnecessary excess water that you don't need. Always just tap it on your paper towel, okay, before you go in. Because as beginners, we tend to go right into our water, right into our paint, and we have this large amount of water on our brush. And while that's nice, it's still going to create this pool. And you're going to get a bunch of color that's going to sit in one area. And then when it dries, the pool dries a lot slower than the rest of it. So this is going to dry first. And then this is going to dry last, which is going to create that little bloom that we don't like. Okay. So instead of going right from your water to your color, what I like to do is create a little puddle in my color. I wash off my brush from my previous color, dry it on my paper towel, then pick up my color, and then you go in like that, okay? Also, one thing you need to check out is how large is your brush? If you are doing a large area like a background, you're going to want a big brush. This is my size 12. I'm pretty good with the size 12. I know how much water it carries personally just from the feel of it. I know how to make it do what I want it to. But if you are newer to this, you're not as familiar with your brushes, first, you need to actually just play around with your brushes just to see how they react and how they work in certain paintings. But I always suggest if you're doing something that's not like a big background piece, use a smaller brush. Use a size 6 because larger brushes carry a lot more water, which is going to force you to add more water than you need. Okay, so use like a size 6 round, which is a really good option because you won't be able to use as much water as you would with a bigger brush. Now, however, if you're doing some small detail and you're using a size 6, and it is possible for you to use too much water. So just, without a doubt, just tap it on your paper towel before you go into the color. Okay, make sure your paints are wet because if you go in with like a damp brush but it's not wet into dry paints, you're not going to be able to pick up much. Make sure you activate your paints before you start. Like I said, with your colors, create a little puddle in your colors and go in with a damp brush, not like a sopping wet brush. And that should be the right amount. So again, the things that you're looking for before you do wet on wet is the area that you're working on pooling to one side when you tilt it. Does it have a nice light sheen that shines over the whole area that's wet that you're working on? If you can already see here, there's no sheen up here anymore. This is drying. There is a little bit of one here because there was more water here because we did this most recently. But this, I would not be able to go in and do wet on wet now. Okay, that's also how you know. See, you're doing wet on dry. You're not getting that wet on wet because there's no sheen. That's how you can practice. That's how you can check and see if it's ready for you to drop in color, okay? So make sure it's not pooling to one side. If it is, mop it up with your paper towel. Look for that light sheen all over the whole thing. Use an appropriate size brush for your work, okay? Again, if you're doing a large background, you're going to want a larger brush. If you're doing something that's maybe this size, I like my size 12, but if I'm trying to add darker shadow into one color, I might use a smaller brush. If I'm doing smaller leaves or something and I'm adding in some darker shadow, actually, let me just do an example of this because this is where I find a lot of people run into this problem. So you're doing your leaves, okay? And sometimes I ask you to go back in and add in a darker shadow. But if there is too much water in your leaves, okay, and it's pooling, which is the first thing we need to check for, okay? See, I'm tilting it and we're getting little pools here. This is what's going to happen when you add in your darker color. I also have too much water on my brush. It's not going to work the way you want it. That color is just soaking into the pool. That's not what we want. Okay, so to try it again, let's add our color. Okay, our leaf here. Okay, tilt it to the side. Check if there's pooling. No pooling, but also look for that sheen. There isn't a sheen right here. There's no shine right there. There's no shine right there. So when I add in that darker color and that wet pigment is only going to go to the areas that are wet. It's going to totally miss that area. It's going to totally miss this area. So what you need to do in that sense, one, make sure you're using an appropriate size brush. This size 6 is perfect for this. I wouldn't use a bigger brush because it carries more water. I don't need to add a lot more water or color with a bigger brush. What I'm going to do Just going to wet my brush up just a little bit, dab it on my paper towel a little bit. I'm going to wet the whole area to make it all the same amount of wetness. Okay? Okay, I'm going to tilt it. I see a sheen across the whole thing. My paint was dry, that's why I added a bit more water on my brush. Just to test it out. Okay, there's not a big explosion of color there. Now when I tap it in, I'm getting the color bleed of the wet on wet that I want. See how that one is still just floating around in that puddle? And this is actually doing the shadowy kind of wet on wet explosion that I want it to do. And it's going to dry evenly because there's an even amount of water on the area that I'm working on. Okay, so I hope that clears it up. Gives you a couple tips on what to look for when you're doing wet on wet or you're adding shadows to a wet surface. Okay, check for pooling, check your sheen, make sure it is the same amount of wetness over the whole thing before you add in your color, and you should be golden. Just make sure you're using the appropriate size brush. Test it out. If you're not sure, test it out. I can only tell you what I know, but you're never going to know until you actually test it out yourself and get a feel for it. So practice. Do a whole page of leaves or circles or whatever, just practicing wet on wet, dropping in darker colors, and you'll be good to go. Thank you guys so much for watching my video. I really hope you liked it and I hope you learned something. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and follow me on Instagram for even more. Have a great day, guys. Bye.